Affairs Center. I'd like to welcome you to Leading Economic Development, a seminar for local public officials and civic leaders. This seminar is being presented by some of our area's experts on the subject of economic development, so I'm certain that all of you will leave today knowing more about the topic than you did before. But in addition to being an educational opportunity, this seminar also marks the launch of a brand new book on the subject of economic development, written by Dr. Daniel Johnson, President Emeritus of the University of Toledo. His book, entitled Leading Economic Development, a Toolkit for Public Officials and Civic Leaders, was published earlier this month. It represents a lifetime of work by Dr. Johnson that he spent both conducting scholarly research about economic development and also implementing economic development projects. During his tenure as president of UT, he recognized the connection between the mission of a metropolitan university and the economy of the city of that university that has called it home for 140 years. That work has continued even after his retirement from the position of president of UT, as his latest book clearly demonstrates. The program today will begin with presentations by Lee Fisher, CEO of CEOs for Cities, and the former lieutenant governor of our state, and by Dr. Johnson. At around 3 o'clock, we will break for a short time and return promptly at 3:15 for a panel discussion led by Dr. Neil Reid, Director of the UT Urban Affairs Center. After the discussion, Dr. Johnson will wrap up the seminar with some concluding thoughts. And I would like to add there is a list that I'm going to send around. If you would please add your name and emails, we'd like to be able to keep in touch with you and maybe get some feedback on the seminar that will help us as we perhaps present it several other times in the near future. After the seminar, I hope you will move next door to the faculty club for a reception hosted by Dr. Johnson to celebrate the publication of his book. He will be available at that time to sign the copies you all received with your registration, and additional copies will be for sale at that time. Now I would like to turn the program over to Dr. Neil Reid, Director of the UT Urban Affairs Center. It is more than appropriate that the Urban Affairs Center be the co-sponsor for this seminar, since what is today the UT Press actually began as the Urban Affairs Center Press some 10 years ago. So Neil is going to introduce our first speakers. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you, Barbara. And the first speaker this afternoon, I'm sure he needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway. We have tremendous privilege for me to introduce Lee Fisher. Lee Fisher is President and CEO of CEOs for Cities. He is a senior fellow with the Center for Economic Development at Cleveland State University's Levin College of Urban Affairs. He has served as the Ohio Lieutenant Governor, Ohio Attorney General, State Senator, State Representative, and President and CEO of the Center for Families and Children. He earned both a law degree and a master's degree in nonprofit organization from Case Western Reserve University, and received the law school's first ever Distinguished Recent Graduate Award. So please give a very warm Northwest Ohio welcome to Lee Fisher.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to come down. I want to begin by thanking my friend Dan Johnson for having us all here today. Dan is a wonderful person, one of the smartest people I know, and somebody who I've learned a lot from on economic development. And I'm here today for two reasons. One, because I love Toledo. You had me at Toledo. And the other because I'm a huge fan of Dan Johnson. And I want to say thank you to all of you. Many of you I know, and I've had the privilege to work with over many years. I particularly want to say hello to the new mayor, who I've known a long time. I worked for Paula Hicks-Hudson when I was the Attorney General. She ran the Toledo office, and I reported to her. I saw Mayor Cardi Finkbinder here, and I want to acknowledge the fact that you've had the loss of three very distinguished and important mayors in a very short period of time. I had the privilege of working with all three, and all of their passing is very sad, and I wanted to acknowledge that and, of course, acknowledge their tremendous public service. I had the privilege of serving most recently as Lieutenant Governor and Director of Economic Development for Ohio. And although I've loved all my positions that I've been privileged to hold in my life, there was nothing more exciting to me than being at the center of trying to help our state of Ohio and its regions grow. And now today, I run a national organization that helps cities and regions share the smartest ideas for being economically successful. So I have the great privilege of being able to travel to a different city almost every different week for the last 4 years. So I've been in over 50 cities, most of them in the United States, and I want to share with you some of the things that I have learned, all of which, by the way, are said far more eloquently in Dan Johnson's book. And so I hope that I do it justice. First thing I want to say is that no city really has secret sauce. But what I'm going to share with you today, the best I can, are some of the things that I think should be in your secret sauce. And then the rest of it is really up to you. Because every city should have some plan, some strategy, some vision. I call it your secret sauce. All of us are here to change the world in our own way. I was moderating a panel at the Clinton Global Initiative about 3 years ago, and sitting next to me was the president of Iceland, Ólafur Grimsson, and he said something I'll never forget. He said, the problem with you Americans is you spend too much time waiting for Washington. Doesn't matter whether you're a Republican or Democrat, conservative, liberal, or moderate. I think probably there's all consensus in this room that Washington is at the height of its dysfunction and hyperpartisanship. And if you want to get something done in America today, I suggest you don't look towards Washington, D.C. I suggest you do this, that you start with your city. Change is happening more than ever before in our lifetimes from the ground up. And in many ways, the last refuge of functional government are our mayors, like Paula, and our county commissioners, like Pete, and others around this country who are really closest to the people. And if you were coming in to Earth from outer space, you would notice something very interesting. We have these vast stretches of desert and water. But only until you got closer to Earth would you see these lights emanating from these places we call cities. What's interesting is that most of our surface of Earth is not human beings. But we huddle together in these places called cities. And a good example of it, of course, is right here in Toledo, where we are huddling together as part of 243 million people who live in only 3% of the surface of the United States. That's called urban. That's called our cities. And there's something magic when we huddle. Not only do we collide, but our ideas collide as well. 65 million people are moving to cities every single year all over this world. To put it in some perspective, that's the equivalent of adding 7 Chicagos to our urban population every single 365 days. Cities like Toledo and the Northwest Ohio region are the incubators of innovation. That's where most of the GDP growth is happening around the world. It's in our cities. And if you want to change your city, and now we get closer to the secret sauce, here are some of the things that I've learned from people far smarter than me like Dan and others around the country. Number one, start with your vision. I want to tell you a quick story. Some of you have heard me say this, but most of you probably have not. This is my mother-in-law, Mary Zone, who was a member of the Cleveland City Council, and my father-in-law, Mike Zone, who was a member of the Cleveland City Council. This is their wedding picture, and 90 days after they were married, Mike Zone was captured as a prisoner of war in World War II at the Battle of the Bulge. And you can imagine how Mary felt having just married this man 90 days earlier. And after he was liberated, he came back and he didn't talk about the experience. But we often wondered how a man who was not as strong as many of the other men, not as young, not as smart, survived when others did not. It wasn't until he pulled out of the closet his diary that we began to understand how Mike Zone survived. This is a diary that today is in the Western Reserve Historical Society. It still is legible almost as the day it was written. And there are two things that jump out from Mike Zone's diary that are worth noting. The first are the 9 children, one of whom would become my wife, that he would raise. He had no children at that time. But more importantly, Mike Zone was an Italian who loved to eat but had no idea how to cook. But all throughout this diary were intricate pasta recipes. I'm saying intricate. So intricate that when he was finally liberated and came back to the near west side of Cleveland, my mother-in-law, Mary, who was a great cook, used those recipes almost to a T, and guess what? When he came back, he still couldn't cook. So how did he survive? He could see beyond the barbed wire. He could see beyond the cruelty of the guards. He could see something that some other men could not. It was his future. He could taste it. He could smell it. He could see it. When I served as Attorney General, I traveled to Ohio's prisons, and I met young men and women who had no sense of their future. For them, Ohio's prisons was a land beyond pain. They came from neighborhoods that were tougher than the prisons in which they were. And so over the years, I've come to believe, and Dan was nice enough to mention this in his book, that the greatest gift you can give a human being, a child, a family, but for that matter, a city, a region, a state, or even a country, is the ability to envision your own future, to see beyond the immediate circumstances of your challenges. That's the greatest gift you can give. So if that's your vision, now how do you execute that vision? Here are some additional items for that secret sauce. One is Wayne Gretzky, that great economist, defined economic development better than anybody I know. He was once asked what makes you a great Hall of Fame hockey player, and he said, hey, I just learned how to skate where the puck was going, not where the puck was. Dan, in his book, talks about seeing over the horizon. And that's what economic development is all about. It's being able to see around the corners in ways that others cannot. So you skate fast and you skate ahead. Why? Because the world's coming at us at lightning speed. Think of all of the information generated on Earth from the beginning of civilization up until the recent 2000s, like about 2003. According to Eric Schmidt, if you took all that information, that's the equivalent of what's generated now, Monday through Wednesday. Every 48 hours, we generate as much information as was generated from the dawn of civilization until the year 2003. There are 7 billion people on Earth. And today, before we go to bed, there will be 8 billion text messages sent, some of them being sent as I speak, right in this room. But here's something that even the smartest people in this room, like Bob Savage, Tom Brady, others, don't know. And that is 42% of those text messages will be sent by one person, my daughter, Jessica. Am I right? You did not know that, right? Okay. So I live this every day. I get this. We have 2 children. Peggy and I have 2 children, Jessica and Jason, who graduated Syracuse University not that many years ago. And when we asked him what he wanted to do with his life, he said something that at the moment I thought was unusual, but I've learned since is really not unusual for his generation. But he said something in a million years I never would have said to my mom and dad. Here's what he said. We said, what do you want to do with your life now that you graduate college? And he said, Dad, Mom, what I want to do hasn't been invented yet. We are teaching students at the University of Toledo and training them for jobs that do not yet exist, using technologies that have not yet been invented to solve problems that even the smartest people in this room, like George Tucker, don't know are problems. That's not a challenge. That's a phenomenal opportunity, but it means that every strategic plan you have on your desk today has a sell-by date that's coming up much sooner than they used to be. So if you've got a plan that says 2020 or 2050, with all due respect, it sounds good, but you're going to have to redo that plan about 5, 6, 7 times between now and the end of that time. So the other thing I would say to you is skate with new eyes. Here's what I mean by this. If you change the way that you look at things, the things that you look at begin to change. And so I suggest you begin to look at Toledo. Look at Northwest Ohio with a new pair of eyes, what might be called a paradigm shift. Because if you do that, you'll begin to see opportunities. Here's a cartoon from the New Yorker. It's a mother pigeon talking to her daughter pigeons, and a man sitting underneath, and the caption reads, "Today is lessons of opportunity." You didn't laugh, but I hope you understand what I was talking about. Okay. It's supposed to be funny. Okay. The point is that those pigeons see a man there. It's a lesson of opportunity, and every city has lessons of opportunity. The key is to identify what those lessons are and what those targets are so that your city looks like this. That's not to suggest that we put our heads in the sand about poverty and traffic congestion and pollution. There's so many issues that we need to deal with and address up front. But it's focusing first on the assets of your city more than anything else. And there's something else that's happening around America. When many people talk about the rebirths of cities, they talk about Chicago and New York City and San Francisco. My experience is a little different. I spend my time in places like Pittsburgh and Dayton and Toledo and Milwaukee. And what I'm finding is it's what's called the rise of the rest. It's the mid-sized and small cities that in many ways are innovating faster and executing faster than the big cities that get all the attention. But having said that, the cities like Toledo and Cleveland, like Pittsburgh and Milwaukee, like Nashville and Knoxville and Asheville, sometimes play too small. They don't think of themselves in terms of Chicago and Philadelphia, even though they should. So I suggest you begin to look at your city and begin to look at Toledo as if it were a startup. That's not easy. They're the oldest institutions on earth. But this is what I mean by saying looking at Toledo with a new pair of eyes. And one of the things that Dan talks about in his book a lot, and that Dan is known for, is skating together, collaboration. Because the days of one sector, the business sector or the public sector, being able to do this alone are long over. With scarce resources and infinite problems, if you don't have everybody rowing in the same direction, you are in trouble and you got separate silos that don't talk to each other. The cities that are doing best around the country have been able to put aside their differences, whether they're political or ideological or personal, and cut across these silos and literally work together and tear down walls, build bridges, and light fires, in the words of Steve Jobs. This rowing together is easier said than done, but I think it can be summed up with this word. Change happens at the speed of trust. When people trust each other at the same table, that's when things happen. Trust is earned. It doesn't happen automatically. But great leaders, not just mayors, but leaders like all of you in the rooms are the ones who focus on that. Here is the framework that we use in our organization. We look at a city through a framework, and we say that there are 4 key things to making a city and a region successful. One is, and by the way, I'm a big believer in making it memorable, so it's no coincidence it spells out the word city. The connected city, the innovative city, the talented city, and your distinctive city. And I'll talk about that in a minute, but there's 4 things that permeate all throughout that framework. Measurable progress, making sure you have metrics and goals that are measurable. Number 2, collective impact, which is a fancy jargon way of saying cross-sector collaboration. Number 3, connecting with other cities around the world so you're not reinventing the wheel and you're catching up and looking over the horizon and seeing the latest cutting-edge ideas. And economic inclusion, doing everything you can so that rising prosperity is shared by all citizens, regardless of their color, regardless of their level of income, regardless of where they live. Harder, easier said than done. But the great cities focus a lot on inclusion. So not just some are benefiting, but everybody's benefiting. And what we do is we use, this is our organizing platform, City Vitals, which is our metrics, City Clusters, which are teams of cross-sector leaders who join us as a team, City Dividends, and City Dividend Prize Challenges that accelerate our work. I'll explain. We do benchmarking. We benchmark 130 metro regions around the country in 30 different areas in each of those 4 categories: connections, innovation, talent, and your distinctiveness. And we've established something called City Dividends. This is basically saying if you have a measurable goal, and you know if you achieve that goal, you're going to have a positive economic impact on Toledo, that's a dividend. That's an economic dividend. That's a city dividend worth shooting for. And so we have actually developed a number of these dividends, which we think are powerful ways to get people to move forward. For example, if you were to increase the number of people in Toledo who have a 2-year or 4-year degree, not by 10% or 5%, but by 1%, it would have a huge increase on the per capita income of the residents, or the average earnings of the people in this city and in this region. If you did that if you increased the number of people who have a 2-year and 4-year degree in the top 50 metro regions in the country, That's a $143 billion increase in per capita income for the United States just from those 50 regions alone. Or what if you reduce the number of miles you travel every year in a car to make your city more walkable and bikeable and to use more transit? Well, we did the calculations and we saw that if in the top 50 regions, everybody in those regions were to drive just 1 mile less per day over the course of a year, they would save $31 billion that's currently spent on parking, repairing your car, filling it up with gas, buying your car, filling up potholes. You get the point. Or what if we reduce poverty by 1%? I didn't say solve poverty, and I didn't say reduce it by 20% or 10%. I said 1%. Why? Because it's achievable, it's doable, it's relatable. And if you did that, that would mean $31 billion less spent on state and federal spending to deal with poverty today in America. So what it's all about is moving the needle in Toledo. Putting a set of goals and then watching that needle move. Why? Because the single greatest motivator of human behavior, according to most research, is the ability to see progress in your work. Most of us are skeptical that we're going to solve problems, but everybody believes we can move the needle towards solving that problem. And so let's look at the connected dividend, for example. We look at things like voting and community involvement, economic integration, transit use, walkability, international students, foreign travel, internet connectivity, because we find in a lot of cities there's disconnections. Great buildings, great architects, but they don't connect with each other. When people visit your city, they're not going to one destination anymore. They're coming for an experience. And so you have to find ways to connect all your assets. That is the best visual depiction of economic development I can think of. It's connecting all your assets. Having assets is no longer enough. It's connecting those assets and being a truly connected city. Not like that. That's not the way to connect your city. That's not the way to have your city be walkable. But walkability has become a key element of why people move to a city, particularly for the millennial generation, but also for the boomer generation that no longer has children, is downsizing and wants to move to town. Project for Public Spaces says that the best way to evaluate whether your city is becoming livable is to identify 10 places in Toledo where in each of those 10 places you can do 10 things. Because if you can only do one thing in those 10 places, not enough. You have to build experiences in each of your key places. So if you're going to a museum, there must be something very close to that museum or easy to get to from that museum. Everything has to be connected. Those are the cities that are doing the best. The ones that bring in retail and shopping, because millennials like to live above where they eat and above where they work, above where they play. Streets have to be changed to look from not like that, but like this. Those are the cities that are doing the best. This is the High Line in New York City. It used to be an old freight tracks that were unused and were abandoned. And some visionary people said, why don't we create an elevated park? It's now arguably the most inspiring elevated park in the world, called the High Line. This is Indianapolis. It's called the Cultural Trail. The city leaders said, we need someplace where people can bike and work, but not out in the wilderness, right through downtown. And it's one of its kind, but other cities are now beginning to follow it. Now, here's an interesting story. The mayor of Oklahoma told me that there was something in his budget for mowing this ditch. Interestingly, that ditch used to be a river. It dried up. And so every year they mowed the ditch and groaned about the fact that at one time it was a river. And then the mayor said, you know what? Let's pass a 1% sales tax, have it earmarked only for downtown development, and let's take some of these old assets and revitalize them. And guess what this looks like today? This is where the Olympic rowing team now has its headquarters, that exact same area. Like Mike Zone did. It's envisioning your future. He did the same thing with this. This is also in Oklahoma City. Guess what? That was also dried up water underneath. And now what's it look like today? This is what it looks like. Canal in Oklahoma City. That's not Chicago. That's not San Francisco. That's Oklahoma City. It could be Toledo. It could be anywhere else. It's identifying places where you can transform and see different things. Cleveland just won the Republican National Convention, and people ask me, how did that happen? Given the fact I'm a Democrat, I certainly can't take any credit for it. But having said that, I will tell you my theory. as to why Cleveland got it. It used to be that you would evaluate whether a city got a convention based upon the number of hotel rooms, heads and beds, and traditional tourist metrics. That's not irrelevant, but that's just the ticket of admission to the game. I often say that if you want to make a great city to visit, make it a great city to live in. That's why Cleveland got it. Why? Because Cleveland showed them that this is a place where you want to live. This is Public Square. Many of you have been there in Cleveland. It's pretty drab. It's supposed to be our signature space. We said to the Republican National Convention, this is our plan, and this is what Public Square will look like by the time you get there. And that's exactly what it will look like in about 18 months. It'll look more like Times Square, literally taking out an entire street and making it one urban park. That's transformation. How many of you remember the Cuyahoga County River burning? That's the Cuyahoga River. This is what it'll look like by the time the Republicans come at the National Convention. It'll be one of the state-of-the-art waterfronts in the world. Now, we're not doing it because of the Republican National Convention. They're coming to us because we're doing it. That's my point. It had very little to do with hotel rooms. East 4th Street, no bigger than this room, is a place where you can't move on Wednesday night and Thursday night. I'm not talking about Friday and Saturday night. I'm talking Monday night, Tuesday night, Wednesday night, Thursday night. It's the hottest place probably in at least Northeast Ohio, if not all of Ohio. And we have a bus rapid transit system that connects downtown Cleveland with University Circle, where the Art Museum is, and Case Western Reserve, and the Cultural Arena. But it's a 3 miles of desert in between, but not anymore, because now we have a bus rapid transit system. And what's happened is economic development has spurred up on Euclid Avenue, all between downtown and University Circle, because of that bus rapid transit system. That's why the Republicans are coming to Cleveland in 2016. Then we look at the innovative city. We look at things like patents and venture capital and self-employment and small business. We call it the innovation dividend. And most of us, when we read The World Was Flat by Tom Friedman, thought that it didn't matter where you lived anymore. It didn't matter where you worked. Well, that's exactly wrong. It's called the location paradox. It's never been more important where you locate your business, despite the fact you can communicate with people around the world in a millisecond. Why? Because the key to economic development is density and proximity. So what's happening around the country are innovation districts in cities all around this country, where they're combining knowledge institutions, medical institutions, research institutions with businesses established and emerging and startups, where basically the best definition I've ever heard of it is, if you think about it, first, Ed Glazer has said that all cities have something in common. They attract smart people, but then they get them to work together. If you have a lot of smart people in your city and they don't work together, then it doesn't really matter that you have a lot of smart people. So think about it all throughout the country. It started with the research triangle, but now every city is finding a place where they can create a different kind of innovation district. And my definition of an innovation district is if you lose your job, you don't lose your parking place. Because you have a density of businesses all within a small geographical area in which you can actually share the best talent and share the best ideas. Barcelona was probably the first city in the world that got that, but now it's happening all across the country, even Las Vegas. And I'm not talking the Strip, I'm talking about downtown Las Vegas, where Tony Hsieh, the CEO of Zappos, instead of moving his campus to the suburbs like Google and Apple did, is moving his campus to downtown Las Vegas and revitalizing it into an innovation district. And then we come to the talent dividend. And we look at things like college attainment, creative professionals, young and restless, which I define under the age of 35. When I first became lieutenant governor, I got a call from a woman named Ginger Graham. She was the CEO of Amlin Pharmaceuticals based in San Diego. And she said to me, congratulations, Ohio is one of 5 finalists for a $500 million manufacturing facility that manufactures a diabetic saving drug, and we're going to bring 500 to 1,000 jobs to Ohio. We've identified Ohio because you're the 5th largest manufacturing state in the country, but we can't tell you, it's a blind competition, who these other 4 states are. I said, okay, well, how do we win? And she said, well, first thing is we want to lower our cost of doing business, so you have to put some money on the table. I think we're in an economic development arms race today that is out of control. But until we change that, you got to play by those rules. So we put together an attractive set of grants and loans and tax incentives on the table. She calls me back 2 weeks later and says, congratulations, it's down to Ohio and another state. And I said, okay, how do we win? She said, here's the key. And this is not her words, this was my interpretation. She basically said to me that those tax incentives, those financial incentives were the ticket of admission to the game. But now that you're in the stadium, now that you're in the arena, the game changer is going to be people, human capital, workforce development. Can you create a workforce pipeline customized to our short-term and long-term needs? That's where we'll go. That's what we'll decide. Dan has a quote in his book from Carly Farina when she was CEO of Hewlett-Packard, who said something similar to a group of economic developers. So I went back to my staff. I had deer in the headlights. I said, let's pull out all of our workforce development programs. They said, well, we don't usually do that. We just put money on the table. I said, it's changed. Money's not enough now. So we got all of the technical schools, community colleges, and Ohio State University in one room. We brought in the Amlin team, spent an entire day, 90% listening, 10% talking. And over the course of 3 months, we put together a customized curriculum to meet their short-term and long-term needs, and that's how we won Amlin, and that's how we won most of the economic development projects that happened over the next 3 years. We learned a valuable lesson, that money is not enough, financial incentives not enough. It's about the human capital. These are not generational decisions. These are not transactional decisions, I should say. They are generational decisions. 63% of jobs will require some college education by 2018. It's $1 million difference of what you'll earn over a lifetime between a high school degree and a college degree. And so college attainment is the single best indicator of individual income. Now, why is that important? Well, I would say that if you were to measure Toledo on only one metric, and of course we know that you shouldn't measure it just on one metric, that's too simplistic, but if you could only choose one, most economists would agree the single best metric to use for economic success of a city is average earnings, per capita income. And the research is crystal clear. The single best way to increase average earnings, to increase per capita income, is educational attainment. There is no doubt it's the single best way to do it. So if that's your metric, 64% of your city's success comes down to one thing: the number of educated, college-educated, or technical school-educated with credentials people you have in your city that you keep here. Not that you graduate and they leave, but that you keep here. So it's talent development and talent attraction and talent retention. There's a demographic earthquake happening today. Young people are moving to cities like never before. It's a huge generational change, but here's some interesting statistics to think about. In 1970, when I used to watch, maybe that was before then, Leave It to Beaver and Ozzie and Harriet, those families no longer exist in most cases in America. 40% of couples in 1970 were married. In 2020, less than 20% of households will be married. We're experiencing a demographic earthquake. We think that we move a lot. We don't. It used to be that in the 60s, 1 out of every 5 people changed their home. Now it's only 1 out of 10. Most people stay where they are. That's the fact, even though we think of ourselves as a mobile society. But there is an exception, and they're called millennials. 36% of the workforce today, 50% of the workforce by the year 2020, and they are the most mobile. That's why we call them the young and the restless. But here's an interesting thing that you need to know. And that is, although 1 million of them are crossing the state borders every year, at age 35, they stop. They anchor and they settle. If you know someone who is 34 years old and you want to get them back to Toledo, you have 1 year. And wherever they are, it's like, musical chairs, they're going to stop in their anchor. I'm exaggerating a little, but you get the point. Your window of opportunity is small, and the competition is intense to get people like you, because you're clearly under 35. And if you're not, it's because I was a politician and I sometimes do that kind of stuff. Okay. Then we also look at distinctiveness, how weird you are. Now, you would think weird is bad, but in our definition, weird is good. We take a look at how you differ from the average consumer norms, culture versus HTV, how many people are sitting on their couch watching TV versus going to something cultural in the city. We look at restaurant variety, internet search variety, but bottom line is it's hard to measure distinctiveness, and we know that. But Dolly Parton, another great economist, said it well, and that is find out who you are and do it on purpose. That's what authenticity means. That's what distinctiveness means. It's finding who you are and not trying to be someone else, not trying to be the Silicon Valley, trying to be Toledo, trying to be where glass has now made it a center for alternative energy. Every city needs to find its purple cow. What makes it different from everyone else? It's not easy. I'm not suggesting it is. Some cities can do it easier than others, but every city needs to have that purple cow. Every city needs to have something, whether it's Asheville, which has MOOCFest, whether it's Grand Rapids, which has the most interesting international art prize competition in the world, where thousands of people from around the world descend on this little city for 3 weeks, and it's become an art mecca now all throughout the year. Why? Because attitude determines altitude. I know it's cliche, but it's a part of being distinctive. I go to Des Moines, and they have a Rodney Dangerfield complex. They feel like they get no respect. But guess what? I get that everywhere. It's in Cleveland. It's probably in Toledo. It's in Pittsburgh. It's in Milwaukee. If you're not one of the big 6 or 7 cities, you feel that somehow you don't get the respect you deserve. And sometimes the people who are the most down on your city are the people who grew up here. The people who moved here aren't down on you. They did this on purpose. So the key is having a T-shirt that says Toledo, hell yes. Now I'm exaggerating, but the point is until Des Moines they started this T-shirt. Even business people wear it now. They said, we're proud of who we are. So that's symbolic of, in other words, suggesting that it starts with you and your attitude. If you want to convince other people to come to Toledo, it's beginning to feel more proud that you're from Toledo than ever before in your lifetime, which is why we told the Republican National Convention, we're not Cleveland, we're Believeland. Now, yes, it helped that LeBron James was back and those kinds of things, but the point is it is attitude in many ways. It's been said that it is our darkness that most frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be famous or gorgeous? But the truth is, Toledo can't play small. The rise of the rest cities I referred to cannot play small because then you can't compete, then you can't win. And you have to think like Oklahoma City and transform those assets and say, like Des Moines says, hell yes. And if you think you're done, you're finished. Because as you know, as soon as you have a success, you got to go. You celebrate it, but you got to go on to the next one because the competition is fierce. So, I want to begin with a serenity prayer for Toledo, or end, I should say. Here's my serenity prayer. God, grant Toledo the vision not to let what we know limit what we can imagine. That was Mike Zone, behind the barbed wire. What he knew was very little food, men next to him dying, but he didn't let that prevent him from envisioning pasta he could eat and 9 children that he would raise. The speed to skate where the puck is going, as Dan Johnson says, look over the horizon. And the spirit to skate together, to put our differences aside and say we can't afford to bicker. We got to find the common ground. And then the final part of the serenity prayer, perhaps the most important, and the wisdom to read Dan Johnson's Leading Economic Development. Thank you very much. Okay.
Lee, thank you very much for a wonderful talk there. Second keynote speaker this afternoon is none other than President Dan Johnson, President Emeritus of the University of Toledo. Dr. Johnson has served in higher education leadership positions for more than 30 years, during which time he has passionately fostered collaborations and partnerships between his universities, government and industry. As president of UT between 2001 and 2006, he eventually led the successful effort to merge UT with the Medical College of Ohio, and in doing so created the 3rd largest college in the state of Ohio. He's published more than 50 research papers and reports, as well as 6 books, or perhaps that's 7 books now, I'm not sure. But please welcome Dan Johnson.
Thanks very much, Neil. I just can't follow that. I mean, that was fantastic. Wasn't that great today to have Lee Fisher with us? Lee, thank you so much. And also thank you for writing the foreword to the book. You know, Lee agreed to do that without even reading the book. So that takes a lot of courage, and I really do appreciate it. Just about 7 or 8 years ago, I don't remember just how long you were lieutenant governor, and we met down the hall in the auditorium down here when we were really trying to push the meta plan. And I asked Lee to come up and be our keynote speaker. Cardi, you were there, and many of you in the room were there. And it was the best speech I had ever heard on economic development. He didn't have a PowerPoint, he didn't have a note, but it was fantastic speech. And ever since then, I've been one of his disciples, and I just can't tell you how much I appreciate your coming to Toledo today and carrying the message about CEOs for cities, which Toledo is enthusiastically responding to. So thank you very much. I have to say, when Barbara and I first started talking about this symposium today, we sent out a lot of invitations and not much came back. In fact, after a week or so, Barbara sent me an email. She said, well, I have 4 RSVPs. So I didn't know if we were going to have 4 people here today or 40 or how many. So it turned out that she guessed about correctly in terms of the number of seats. But thank you very, very much, Barbara, for doing this. And Neil, I can't thank both of you enough for that. If you want to take on a big job, I can tell you, you want Barbara Floyd on your team. She is really a hard driver. And I might just mention Neil, who directs our Center for Urban Affairs, is rolling out a major new data repository that is going to serve Lucas County in Northwest Ohio. And some of you who have not heard about this, it's going to be an easy-to-use, massive data bank that's going to serve all kinds of needs for economic development and other purposes. So if you haven't heard about it, speak with Neil during the reception, and he will give you more information on that. I'd also like to express a word of sincere appreciation to Dr. Lloyd Jacobs and to our interim president, Dr. Nagi Naganathan. We call him Nagi. A few years ago, I had a publisher for this book, and when I talked to Dr. Jacobs about it, he felt that this would be a good thing for the UT Press to publish to show its support for economic development. And I was so pleased. I had some little question about if that was the right decision for this. And then when Dr. Naganathan came on board as our interim president, he swung right in behind Dr. Jacobs and said, yes, I want to support this effort. And so I want to express my appreciation to both Dr. Jacobs and Nagi. Nagi sent his apologies. He's on his way back from Phoenix or some warm spot someplace, and he couldn't be here today. There are scores of people that I would love to thank personally for helping with this book. Some of them are here today, but I would like to just mention a few. Jim Hartung, Peter Kay, Dean Monsky, Larry Conway. Larry Conway is my new boss, and every day he says, Dan, have you done this? And Dan, have you done that? And make sure you get that done. Larry, I can't tell you how much I appreciate your strong moral support for this. Jim Tushman, here, Jim and I have had so many conversations about economic development, I can't count them, Jim. But thank you for your encouragement. Brian McMahon, we talk and exchange emails regularly about ideas that he has, and I really appreciate him very much. John Such, Jerry Jakes is here. Jerry and I exchange emails a lot on the topic of regionalism, and Paul Toth and many others who have been so helpful and supportive as I've worked on this project and in our time here. I try to mention most of them in the acknowledgement section of the book, but for those of you who are here, thank you very much for all that I've learned from you. And I would also be remiss if I didn't mention Elaine, who came today. Elaine proofread the manuscript more than once. I have to say she is really, really good at catching my mistakes. And she caught a few of them in the manuscript. Honey, thank you very much for the role you played in bringing this forward. I thought rather than talking about what's in the book or going through the ideas in the book, what I would do today without a PowerPoint is to share the story behind this book. We call it Leading Economic Development, a toolkit for public officials and civic leaders. I have to thank my friend Lee for suggesting the subtitle for this, a toolkit. And when he mentioned it, I said, Lee, I need a subtitle. He came right back with that, and that stuck, and I'm glad that you mentioned it. But what I thought I would do today, since most of us in here know each other pretty well, I thought I would just, rather than go through what's in the book, I hope you'll read it, but to tell you how it came about and why I decided to devote some time to this subject and why I wanted to focus on this, who the audience is for the book, what topics I felt I should cover, and all the questions that every author has to answer, not only for him or herself, but for the publisher. To be quite honest with you, this started over 40 years ago. You're very generous in saying I've been in higher education 30 years. Just add a decade to that, okay, and then you'll be closer to it. But it really started about 40 years ago after teaching in a couple small private church-related colleges. Right after going into the profession, I was invited in 1973 to join the faculty at the University of Illinois, Springfield. In the early days, it was called Sangamon State University. It's the name of the county there, but it did become the University of Illinois, Springfield. And this was a new university located in the capital, and it had a public affairs mission. Well, when I was invited to join the faculty there, I was excited and went as a regular faculty member teaching sociology, research methods, and demography, and urban affairs. Within a year, the Dean of Public Affairs asked me to come to his office. He said, Dan, I'd like for you to direct a new center that we're going to create here and get this title. It was called the Center for the Study of Middle-Sized Cities. How about that? And your comment about middle-sized cities. The rationale was this: in Illinois, everybody studied Chicago. Chicago is the most researched city in the United States, and you had the University of Chicago sociologists and others going all the way back to the turn of the last century who were producing book after book after book on Chicago, and nobody was looking at downstate. And so what our dean wanted me to do was to take a look at Springfield, Peoria, Decatur, Champaign-Urbana, Normal, Rock Island, Rockford, and even East St. Louis. And some of you know the challenges of East St. Louis. So that was my charge as director of this new Urban Affairs Center, the Center for the Study of Middle-Sized Cities. And I spent, as director there, I spent 5 years studying these cities, working with their mayors, writing papers, mostly demographic stuff, because that's all I knew. And however, at the end of that, I did produce a book, and I laid it out there on the counter. It's called The Middle-Sized Cities of Illinois, Their People, Their Politics, and Quality of Life. I've never been happy with that book. In fact, it's been kind of an embarrassment for me, but I did think, in all honesty, I needed to share some of the bad stuff, hopefully with some of the better stuff. I don't want anybody to read it, but I did put it out there for you to see. But it is what it is, and but that experience, though, even though the people didn't read the book necessarily, it did call attention to middle-sized cities, which is what I really wanted in the first place. The most important thing I did as director of that center was to get off campus and into city halls and into county courthouses and to learn to talk to public officials. You know, academics have their own language, and, you know, I've heard someone say academics speak in tongues, and but, you know, public officials have their own language too. They have their own nomenclature, they have their own culture, and there is a gap between the academic culture and the public affairs culture. And I found myself gravitating toward the public affairs culture because I thought there was a lot we could learn from each other. So in those early days back in the 70s, I really enjoyed getting off campus and starting to meet and learn about the public affairs culture. And to be honest, I really, really did enjoy this. The fact is, I enjoyed being off campus more than on campus. It was a new experience. I learned some of the language. I learned some of the challenges. I also learned how universities can help public officials in addressing the major challenges that we have. In 1979, following 6 years in Springfield, Illinois, I was invited to go to Virginia Commonwealth University to direct a PhD program in social policy. That was just perfect for me. And here again, I was drawn into the policy arena and the world of public officials. And this also was a capital, Richmond, Virginia, another state capital where you had all the state agencies and state public officials around. And so that was another enticement. In fact, turned out that Elaine was offered and accepted a job working for the Virginia legislature. So she was sort of my in-house spy. She could tell me what was going on. She edited the bills and indexed all the bills and all that. And so it was great. However, unfortunately, a year after arriving at VCU, I was asked to be a department chairman. Now, most people thought that was a promotion. And this was a large PhD granting department. We had 22 faculty and about a dozen adjuncts, and this job pulled me back onto the campus and literally into the sociology building and away from the policy arena. And honestly, I can tell you, I did not like being a department chair. It's a very tough job. I could never make the faculty happy, and I promise you, they didn't make me very happy either. And I missed working in the community. I missed working in public affairs, and so that was a 5-year stint that took me away from what I was really interested in. In addition to the duties as a department chairman, though, I taught demography and advanced research methods, and after 5 years, I was able to get out of that job with a little bit of dignity. And in the fall of 1985, I launched what we called the Virginia Commonwealth University Survey Research Laboratory, which was to be a data gathering, data analysis unit primarily focused on public policy, local and state. And an interesting thing happened. I went to the dean and asked for some money to start this, and she said, well, I only asked for $30,000, and she said, it's a great idea, we don't have any money, go ahead and start it, you'll have to earn your keep. But they did give me space in the attic of the administration building. It was a nice large area, and in the old west end of Richmond. And as a consequence, almost simultaneously with getting this started, Chuck Robb was governor of Virginia at that time. And Governor Robb created something that he called the Commission on the Future of Virginia. And I saw this, I thought, this is fantastic. I actually made an appointment in the governor's office to meet with his staff, and I said, I've got this new research center. Who's doing the research for this commission on the future of Virginia? And they said, well, we weren't really planning on doing that. And I said, you really need to do some real research. It's not about what the commission thinks, it's about what the people of Virginia think about the future, and you really ought to know what that is. And they bought it. They said, we don't have any money, but we'd like for you to do the research. So I go back to the vice president for research, Frank, and I said, I've been invited by the governor to do this research, and they would like for the university to support it. And by golly, they did. And so I became the research arm of the Governor's Commission on the Future of Virginia. Now, it turned out that Governor Robb invited James Schlesinger to chair the commission. Some of you may recognize that name. James Schlesinger was former director of the CIA. He was President Nixon's Secretary of Defense and a number of other very important jobs in Washington. And if you've ever seen James Schlesinger on TV, you know he's very austere, very authoritarian kind of a guy. And they asked me to meet with him to get his thoughts on what kind of research we want to do. And I met with James Schlesinger, and I have to tell you, I was absolutely terrified. The whole meeting, I'd seen him on TV and testifying for Congress, and here I was, young professors meeting with James Schlesinger alone in the same room, and he had some ideas. We didn't really talk that long. He said, well, I would like for you to do a few things, and so that's exactly what I did. But I Googled James Schlesinger's name just the other day to see what happened to him, and I learned that he died last year. And he is from New England. And the interesting thing to me was that he was buried at Ferncliff Cemetery in Springfield, Ohio, where my grandparents are buried. I thought, wow, what a strange coincidence. No particular meaning there at all, but it's just a strange coincidence. But having done that research for the Governor's Commission on the Future of Virginia, a strange thing happened. It just opened all kinds of doors in almost every state agency. If you've done work for the governor, you've done work for James Schlesinger. So I had instant credibility, and as a consequence, I ended up with the Survey Research Lab over a period of about 5 years, doing research projects on almost every state agency. And these included transportation and traffic studies, wildlife. I did a major policy study on trout fishing. I did a major study on deer hunters. And it's just all kinds of interesting things. Museums, low-income university students, how to finance their education. Community colleges, one of the biggest contracts I had was to do a major comprehensive study of the Virginia Community College system. I don't recall, but I think there are 23 community colleges in Virginia, and had a chance to meet with the leadership of all of those for a period of about 18 months and help outline a strategic plan for them. Quality of life studies were popular back in that time. Did a lot of those, and of course, economic development, a lot of those studies. At one time, we had 40 people working in the Survey Research Lab, and I'd done about $1 million worth of research. That was a lot of money back in the 1980s. But the lesson here for me during all this time was the important role that universities can play in supporting our public agencies, our public officials, in helping them gather objective data, good data, offer some policy options, and sometimes even thoughtful recommendations. The other lesson for me during this time was sort of the implicit question in every study that we did was how to strengthen local economy. No matter what the issue was, it always seemed that underneath all of that was the economy. And it reminded me of Bill Clinton's famous quote, "It's the economy, stupid." And so much of what we really do in government, public policy, public affairs is dealing with the issues of economic development. How do you grow? How do you strengthen? How do you leverage our local economies to benefit our citizens, all of our citizens? Fast forward 1991, I had an invitation to go to the University of North Texas in Denton, Texas as a Dean of Social and Behavioral Sciences. The thing that attracted me, though, was the name of the school where these departments were housed. There were 7 departments and 2 research centers. But the name of the school was the School of Community Service. And I just loved it. I thought, universities need to have more of that kind of language. My job, kind of picking up on what you said, Lee, my job when the president talked to me, Al Hurley, was to connect my college with the community leaders, with community organizations to solve problems and issues, and to be a model for the other schools at the University of North Texas. To connect our faculty, to connect our students, our graduate students, help them with their research, with their setting policy, help them with their jobs. And so going to the University of North Texas just was kind of an extension of what I'd been doing. Let me just tell you one story about our time in Denton, Texas at the University of North Texas. The mayor of the city of Denton was a man by the name of Bob Castleberry. That name probably doesn't mean much to you today, but people knew Bob as the mayor, but he was known much more as a celebrity because he was a person who actually won the Publishers Clearinghouse $10 million. And no matter where he went, people weren't interested in what he was doing as mayor. They wanted to know about the Publishers Clearinghouse. And when he won that was in 1989, 1990. Bob started wearing New York tailored suits, and he bought a white Rolls Royce. So here was the mayor of Denton, Texas, driving around in a white Rolls Royce. But economic development was Bob Castleberry's centerpiece for his 3 two-year terms. One of the great lessons I learned from Bob Castleberry, and we spent quite a bit of time together, he believed that economic development, I'd like for you to get this, he believed that economic development should start at the bottom. And I thought, I'd never heard that before. Start at the bottom among those who need it most. And economic development first for the needy. He said to me one day, he said, the wealthy can wait, the poor can't. And so we started at the bottom, and he and I, Elaine will remember this period. We started meeting for lunches, and we didn't want to go to a restaurant or anything. I literally went by Safeway store, picked up a loaf of bread, some bologna, a jar of mayonnaise, and some tomatoes. We went into my office. This sounds like having lunch at Bob Savage's office. And we had bologna sandwiches in my office and talked about how can we start economic development serving the needs of the poor first. And as a consequence of that, we went to the Salvation Army, got a plan for bringing Salvation Army in to address the needs of the homeless. Long story short, we raised the money. We got the Salvation Army there. They're still there today. I Googled them. They're alive and well. And he went on to do other things. But I came away from that experience where you start economic development with those who need it most. And I'll never forget that. And Bob Castleberry, we're here today speaking. He would say, let's get behind the big Cherry Street Mission project and work up from there. This is a picture of Bob Castleberry. He died. This is the Dallas Morning News. Denton Mayor won sweepstakes. And it's an incredible story of a man with $10 million and how he used his money and his position to focus economic development on those who need it most. Fast forward from Denton, Texas, we went to University of Alaska, Anchorage. And my boss there, a man by the name of Lee Gorsuch, he was chancellor at the University of Alaska. The Board of Regents and Lee Gorsuch said, Dan, here's the deal. We want you to bring this idea of the connected, engaged university to the University of Alaska, Anchorage. Connectivity. And I tried to do that in Denton. I tried to do that in Richmond, in Springfield. And so now the palette was a little bigger, and we could start talking about a whole university. Interestingly, University of Alaska Anchorage has 18,000 students. You wouldn't think that a small state like that would have so many students, but we had 18,000 students with several campuses. So the question for me was, where do I start? We had a beautiful campus. The buildings were built with Arctic engineering standards. For engineers here, you know what that means. Earthquake resistant, you needed that. We had quite a few little earthquakes, nothing serious like the 67 earthquake, but we had a lot of those beautiful lakes, a lot of wildlife in Anchorage. It was great. One Sunday afternoon when we first got there, I wanted to take Elaine over to the campus to show her some of the little lakes we had on campus and just walk around. And so we got over there, and it looked a little bit like a wilderness. And Elaine said, I don't think I want to do this. There might be bears out there. And I said to her, honey, we're on a camp. Don't worry. Okay, so she gets out, and we start walking. We had gone about 100 yards, perhaps, from the car, and there was a young man coming at us this way. You'll remember it very clearly, better than I will, Elaine. Young man. And we said hi, and he said, did you see the bear tracks? And so we just turned right around and, of course, went right back to the car. And but that was on our campus in Anchorage. And so you can see why sometimes I have a little bit of a credibility problem with Elaine, at least. the fact is, on that campus, we did have a lot of moose. I actually saw a wolf one day walking along the edge of one of our little lakes out of my window. I could see it. And we get bear on campus from time to time. It's a fantastic campus, actually. And today, Anchorage, supported by the University of Alaska Anchorage, is one of the world's leading logistics hubs. And that didn't happen by accident. Of course, they had perfect location, being where they are on the upper side of the globe. But today, FedEx is there with a major global terminal. UPS is there, Alaska Airlines, huge. And there are several other major Asian cargo carriers working out of Anchorage, Air China, Korean Airlines, Singapore, Malaysian, New Zealand, and the list goes on. You go out to the Anchorage airport, and some of you have been there. You just look at the rows of planes from all over the world bringing cargo into Anchorage, and from there distributed all over the world. And so Rick Mystrom, I don't know if that name rings a bell, Cardi, or not, but Rick Mystrom was mayor of Anchorage, and he had been an advertising executive. And Mayor Mystrom made a presentation to our University Board of Regents, and he asked the university to develop a global logistics and supply chain management program at the university in support of the global logistics that he wanted to nurture there in Anchorage. He wanted undergraduate programs. He wanted master's and graduate programs. He wanted faculty who could do research on global logistics that would inform decision making in Anchorage. And he wanted people trained there. Now, Anchorage is a great city, a beautiful city, and most anybody would like to live there, but it's so far from the lower 48 that it was hard to recruit people there because of just the distance and family and all that. So Mayor Mystrom's idea was, we're going to grow our own. We're going to produce the people we need here in Anchorage to make Anchorage a global logistics hub. And he said to me, he said, if we want to be a logistics hub, we have to have trained logistics people, and I'd like for you and the university to develop that. The mayor literally was putting together all of the pieces to create what we would call today a global logistics cluster, and or we called it in that time a hub. Now, it's a fascinating story, and I wish I had time. I could spend an hour telling you about this story, but this is a great example of what is now sometimes referred to as the triple helix, and that is government, industry, and universities working together to advance economic development and advance their city, working together, collaboration. He and I, Mayor Mystrom and I, it kind of helped. We went to the same church, and I'd see him occasionally at church. He and I met weekly and started working together, and he asked me as the provost then to pull together the faculty, develop a plan, develop a proposal that would bring the assets, the knowledge assets and student assets in logistics to the university. I got the dean of business and other faculty members. We went to conferences, meetings. He wanted me to build a budget to tell him how much it was going to cost. We did all that. Turned out I was going to need $250,000. I didn't have it in my budget. He said, well, we'll get the money. So the way he did it, Bob, is somewhat like what we did when we were raising money for the business school, where we would meet with individual general managers. We started with FedEx, and he would invite them into the mayor's office, and I was there, and he said, we're going to advance the city's capacity in terms of global logistics, and the university is ready to help. Dan, tell them what you're going to do. I had 10 minutes, maybe 5 minutes, the elevator speech, the so-called elevator speech. I told him what we were going to do was going to cost $250,000 to get started, upfront cost. The mayor turned to the general manager of FedEx. He said, we'd like for you to put $50,000 in this. Okay. That was easy. After the FedEx guy left, we just looked at each other. Hey, we ought to just keep going, you know. So we did. And we brought UPS in. UPS agreed to $50,000. We brought in carrier after carrier. all of them contributed. We got the $250 in about 2 weeks, $250,000 in about 2 weeks, and then the ball was in my court to put the program together. Now, coming from Anchorage to Toledo, it was just almost too obvious to see the potential parallels between what they were doing in Anchorage, what they were actually doing, and what we had as potential to do right here in Toledo with the Great Toledo Express Airport. And what little bit I'd learned about global logistics, Jim, you and I had talked about this, I don't know how many times, that Toledo had many of the same qualities, locational qualities, intermodal capacity, traffic, population, all of these things. And it was hard for me to see that, and it still is hard for me to see that and not take full advantage of where we're at and what we have here. And I know there are a lot of good reasons why we haven't been able to move forward on that, but I believe it's one of those things that ought to be a priority for our region. Fast forward, 2001, we moved to Toledo, University of Toledo, as president here. Many of you know this, Jim knows this, Jim Tushman and the board members at that time. Much of my time was spent trying to connect with the city, in some cases kind of reconnect where those relationships had been bruised, and spent quite a little bit of time in the community getting acquainted with many of you in this room here. And that, in my view, was what great metropolitan universities do. They connect. And I think there may be a little misunderstanding about what that means, but great metropolitan universities include institutions like Ohio State and Penn and Wayne State and UMass Boston. There are 150 of them that have self-identified themselves as metropolitan universities, meaning that they have as a part of their mission connecting, bringing people together to do things that we can't do on our own. And that's what we were working at and continue to work at here. And I remember talking with Cardi. Cardi was so generous when we moved to Toledo. He came out the house, bought Elaine a big basket of stuff made in Toledo, and enjoyed a warm relationship with Cardi. Jack Ford and I were both born in the same town, Springfield. I was shocked. We were out of town when he passed away, and I was shocked of his loss. And of course, Mike Bell worked very closely with Mike on international things and trying to expand our international connectivity. And then the great loss of our mayor, Mike Collins, what a loss that was. And I know how intent he was on economic development and trying to bring people together. He had a quality for doing that. So great to have you here, Sandy, today. We really appreciate you coming and all that you and Mike have done for us in this town. I was able to work with a few of our city council members and got acquainted with them and heard their priorities. They knew that economic development was part of their duties and what they had to do. Then there were a lot of, I was actually on Dean's board, the RGP, for a number of years, and it was clear that the civic leaders on these boards had some major responsibilities for economic development. And as I think about this, the board members, the civic leaders, the public officials are really the economic development strategists for our region. Dean and Paul and Ford and all of those on the front lines, in many ways you could almost say they're the tacticians. They're the ones who actually go out and do it. But the strategy, the overall strategy, whether we recognize it or not, really is set by our public officials and the board members of these organizations. So as I sat on these boards that focused on economic development, the Chamber board for a while, the RGP, worked pretty closely with Jim Hartung during these years at the port and some of our county commissioners at the time. It was clear that they were dealing with what we would call strategies. And for real estate brokers, the mantra is location, location, location. For public officials today, it's economic development, economic development, economic development. So over the years and over the decades, working in the policy arena with mayors, public officials, civic leaders, I felt I was learning something important about economic development. Every university I've served, every city we've lived in, and we've lived in a few, economic development has been a priority, often the number one priority. So here's the challenge. Here's the problem, if you will. And I really benefited from talking with Lee about this a year or so ago. Let's say you're a pharmacist and you run for city council and you're elected. As a new member of city council, you're called on to take positions on matters affecting the economy, but you're a pharmacist and you may have never had an opportunity to study economic development, but all of a sudden it is your responsibility. What do you know as a pharmacist about economic development? Let's say you're a teacher or a professor and you're elected mayor of your city. Let's say you taught English or maybe even political science. What do you really know about economic development? But that's all of a sudden your job. That's your portfolio. You're the strategist. What do you know about it? Let's say you're an attorney and you're invited to sit on the board of your local economic development agency or organization. Maybe you're a trial lawyer. What do you really know about economic development? But now, as a board member of your economic development organization, you are responsible for economic development in your region or in your city. So you're responsible for the strategies. You're responsible for the success of that organization. The unfortunate truth is the vast majority, and I emphasize this word, the vast majority of new public officials have little or no background in economic development, but that's a big part of the job. Mostly it's on-the-job training, learning from others who've been there, and after a while you kind of pick up the language, you pick up the issues, you pick up the challenges, you find out where the investors are. But it takes time to get to that point where you feel comfortable talking about and making million-dollar decisions, multi-million-dollar decisions, taking a building down or putting a building up. These are politically very tricky decisions, and every public official here knows how tricky this could be. And so I know the balancing act that they have to perform to keep things moving. So here's what I have observed. Most new people coming into these very important jobs have no real background. Maybe they've never even read a book about. And most of the books, most of the literature is for the practitioner, for the Dean Monskys and the Paul Tosts of the world, people that are out there on the front lines. There was nothing that I could find in there about the people that make the broad strategy, the public officials and the board members that oversee the work. And so as a consequence, I thought, well, maybe based on just the position after position that I had, what are some of the lessons that might be useful for these folks that are taking on these awesome responsibilities as city council, county commissioners, mayors? What can I do to perhaps introduce that language, the concepts, the mechanisms, the strategies of economic development that might speed this process of learning up for them? These are all, we know, smart people. They're highly motivated, they're hardworking, they're conscientious, they're caring people, and they're our community leaders, and we really appreciate the work that they're doing. So how can we help them? And so the idea here was to try to capture in this little book some of the things that I've observed over the years. And so that was my starting point for the book. How can we help public officials, new public officials particularly, and civic leaders who are doing the long, hard, stressful days at improving our local and regional economies, help them be more successful? What tools would they find useful to have in that toolkit on day one, or even between the election and when they take office? This is not a book for the practitioners. It's not a book for Dean or Paul or Ford or their fellow professionals. It's not for them, although I hope they'll read it and recommend it to their boards. They have their professional training. They have their professional associations and meetings, conferences and literature. They know this stuff. They should know it, or we shouldn't have hired them, but they do know it. My goal in doing this book, friends, was to at least make an effort to help the new public officials and recently engaged civic leaders who are really trying to make a difference in economic development. It's a toolkit, as Lee called it. It's a primer. It's a starting point. It's not an end point. And it's designed to help the board members ask the right questions, to select the right people, and to approve the right strategies and policies. To succeed in this highly competitive enterprise of economic development, we need enlightened regional strategists. And public officials and engaged civic leaders are those regional strategists. So finally, if you read the book, and I hope you will, you'll find in these 12 chapters about 5 themes that I'd like to just mention, around which I believe it's possible to build an effective regional strategy. These 5 themes are the following. First, true collaboration. We're not talking about just communication or cooperation, but co-laboring, working together, teams. This can't happen without trust, that was mentioned, nor can it happen if you're worried about who's going to get credit. So true collaboration is one of the themes that I hope you find as you read through it. The second is the power of clusters. I think Michael Porter at Harvard has it exactly right. This is a tool that successful cities are using to attract industry, to build workforces, and so the power of economic clusters, I think we have a little bit of work to do on that. Another theme is that regionalism trumps parochialism every time, and you can't develop strong, successful, competitive economies if you have 47 local governments or 52 or 25 each doing their own thing. It just won't happen. I don't think we've really learned that lesson totally yet here in Northwest Ohio. Jerry Jakes and I don't know how many conversations we've had about how do we encourage regional collaboration, working together as a region. Then there is the theme of the critical role of colleges and universities. Area colleges and universities, not in this town, but in many towns, are often overlooked. But they can be, and I think should be, central players in economic development, maybe even a centerpiece. They're the major resources for workforce development, for applied research, data gathering, substantive expertise, and they are neutral territory, which is really perhaps one of their most valuable characteristics. The fifth theme that I hope you see running through this is the importance of a global perspective. We are part of an increasingly highly integrated global economy. And I've traveled with many of you to places, and Jim, our trips to China just opened our eyes at just how these economies are so integrated today. We need to understand our place in the global economy and how we can get a bigger piece of the action through that understanding. If maybe there's one other theme that runs through this, and maybe it's an overarching theme, and that's leadership. Not only leadership on an individual level, being willing to take some risk and stepping out there, pulling people together, connecting, but also leadership as a city and as a county and as a region, doing things that we can that actually exemplify leadership for other places. If this book does anything to encourage those, it will have been very satisfying. So I talked a little bit too long, but thank you very much for being here today. We're going to take a little break now. Thank you very much.
Dr. Johnson, thank you very, very much. Your kind of personal story there was absolutely fascinating, and I think we all enjoyed hearing that. We did have a 15-minute break scheduled. I'm going to ask you to keep that to 5 minutes. Time to go to the bathroom, grab a cup of coffee. There will be an opportunity to do networking after the panel discussion when we have the reception. So keep the networking to the minimum. Go to the bathroom, grab some coffee, and be back here in 5 minutes, especially with the panelists, please.